Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I'm Marta DiForti. I'm a consultant psychiatrist, so I'm a clinician, but also I'm a researcher. And currently I have funding to do research in the link between cannabis use and psychosis. And this is what I will be talking to you about in light as well of my experience as a clinician or working with young people that develop psychosis in the context of their cannabis use. So first of all, I would like to share with you all what is now a very clear and consistent literature that has linked cannabis use with the later onset of psychotic disorder. This literature, which includes longitudinal study, cross-sectional study, case control study, has been summarized in 3 meta-analyses, but it's only really in the last of these meta-analyses where we've been able to take into account also the amount of cannabis that people use. And in this graph on your right-hand side, you can see lots of lines. Each of these lines represents one of the study entering the meta-analysis. On the x-axis, you have a continuous measure of cannabis exposure, how much people have been using. And on the y-axis, you have a measure of the risk, the odds ratio, or how likely they were to have developed a psychotic disorder, so a clinical condition with psychosis. And as you can see, for all the studies, greater was the amount of cannabis use, greater was the odds ratio, with an overall pool estimate of 4, which means that for heavy cannabis use, there is a 4-fold increase in the probability of developing a psychotic disorder. So what do we know about psychosis in the context of cannabis use? So we're really talking about psychosis that presents mostly with changes in the thinking process, and in particular in the belief system. People tend to develop delusion that we consider ideas they are developed against the evidence of the contrary, and they are uncheckable. They usually are worries about the experience of being under threat or being in danger when it comes to cannabis associated psychosis, but it can also be bizarre in nature. And usually they are not shared by the social background or cultural background of the individual. And what we usually see in young people who develop psychosis in the context of cannabis use, like the young man in this picture, is that they feel really threatened. They feel everything around them is referential to them. The television, it talks about them. If they come across people in the community, they feel that they know what they're thinking, that they laugh at them. And even within their own home environment, sometimes they feel that their radiator has been microchipped. There is something recording what they say in their own flat. So the environment overall becomes very intrusive and very threatening. And in the context of working with young people that have these experiences and use cannabis, I have really, in the conversation with them, developed the following 2 research questions. Well, the first one is very dear to me because they usually say, well, Dr. DiForti, you're telling me that I've developed psychosis because of my cannabis use, but lots of my friends out there are still using and they have no problem with psychosis. So the first question is actually, who are the cannabis users at risk of developing psychotic disorder? Because we know it's still a minority of them. And when you think about the initial literature about cannabis use and psychosis, it was really based on data that were asking people, have you used cannabis, yes or no, at some point in your lifetime? And of course, this is a very vague way to capture the potential harmful effect of cannabis on mental health. If you think about alcohol and liver disease, you don't go around asking people, have you ever drunk alcohol, yes or no, and then you have an estimate of how likely they are to develop liver problem. You ask them how many units a day, how many units in a week, you want to know when did they start, and you also have an estimate what the risk is depending from the gender. And in cannabis literature, we were very far from being so detailed. So the first place to start, I thought, might have been actually how much people use in terms of what is the amount of cannabis, for instance, in the joint, and also the type of cannabis they use. And again, the analogy with alcohol is very different if you have a bottle of lager a day rather than you have a bottle of whiskey a day. And the other question is more related to the impact at the population level, and is really if there is a relationship between cannabis use and psychosis. When we see increase in prevalence of cannabis use in the population, we should also see an increase in the number of new cases of psychosis in that population. So let's start with what is the experience we have in London. So in London, we really have mostly, or we had, I should say, 3 types of cannabis. This one, which is a traditional grass or weed, and also this one, which is really the queen of the street of London. And you don't need to be an expert in plants, in the cannabis sativa, to see the difference between the two. So the one on your right is much more dense in fluorescence, these sort of fluffy bits, which contain the active ingredient of cannabis. Including the 2 that we know the most of. They are THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD cannabidiol. And of course, we shouldn't forget there are other 142 as well that we still don't know much about. And this one on your right is called skunk, from the little animal, which in English is the one that in Italy we call puzzola, for instance, and is very well known for a very strong smell. And in between, we have what actually is more popular in Spain, hashish or resin, that normally comes to you and then to the rest of Europe from Morocco. And in 2008, our Home Office decided to look at a large random sample of cannabis seized by the Metropolitan Police across UK to look at what was the content of the 2 main active ingredients we knew about at the time, THC and CBD, and define what we call the potency of a type of cannabis. So for the skunk, they found that on average, the amount of THC was around 16%. For the imported herbal, which is the sort of old-fashioned weed on your left-hand side, they found there was 5 and 6% roughly on average of THC. Both skunk and imported herbal didn't have any or very little traces of CBD. And then there was the hashish, available up to 2010, which still had low THC, but also had an equal amount of CBD. And we'll see why this might be relevant. We have done a new Home Office study in 2018, where we've shown the skunk has not gone up, imported herbal has disappeared, and hash has dramatically changed. It's actually hash coming from Morocco, and it does have much higher THC, and as well as got no longer CBD. Why do we want to know about type? Well, we did a study where we recruited a large sample of young people developing their first episode of psychosis and coming to the attention of a large mental health service in London. And we also recruited an equal proportion of healthy volunteers representing the general population where the cases were coming from. And to all the participants, we asked many questions, including detailed history of their cannabis use. That included how frequently they were using and the type of cannabis they were using. And we combined the data about frequency and type into a scale, which tell us, compared to people that never use, which are this reference group 1, those who were using hash less than once a week rather than a weekend or every day, and we did the same for skunk. And as you can see, when we compare the risk for psychotic disorder of the one using skunk every day, this was above 5 times. So that this group had 5 times greater risk of developing a psychotic disorder than the one who never used cannabis. People get very excited about these data on hashish and said, oh, wow, hashish looks like it's reducing my risk for psychotic disorder, where this is actually not statistically significant. It's just telling you really that the people who were using hashish in those days, so old-fashioned hashish, were not having an increase in the risk of developing a psychotic disorder compared to people that never use. And this is probably due to the fact that this was still an hashish who had CBD in equal proportion to THC. And we'll see why this might be relevant. But also what we wanted to look was how these had an impact at the population level. And it was quite nice because we got lots of media attention, and I hope the young people might have been interested in our paper and took notice of our data. I don't know about young people, but we do know the Queen now, when she receives a sample of cannabis, she smells it to make sure it's not skunk, and otherwise she discards and not tries it for tea. But also what we wanted to do was to see, could we calculate a measure of how these had an impact at the population level? So when you do a case control study, you can calculate the population attributable fraction, which is a measure of how much the specific risk factor in the specific geographical area where the study was carried out can account for a number of new cases. And so we found that 20% of new cases of psychotic disorder in the geographical area where the study was carried out could be attributed to skunk use. And the flip of the coin is that if we had been able to abolish skunk use in our geographical area, we would have prevented 24 new cases of psychosis, which for clinical services, but also at an individual and society level, is a huge prevention. But what about people who have developed a psychotic disorder and they might hope that by continuing to use cannabis or even starting using cannabis in the first place after the onset of the illness, they get relief from some of their symptoms? Well, what we now know very clearly is that if you develop a psychotic disorder in the context of cannabis use and continue to use, and especially you use frequently and you use type of cannabis like skunk, so high potency, or if you start using cannabis after the onset of your psychosis, you would have much more difficulties in recovering. So you would be more likely to have relapses, so that the symptoms will come back if they've got better. You'll be much more likely to be re-hospitalized. And this is a study that was carried out in UK. You're much more likely to be admitted in intensive care psychiatric unit. So very difficult and unit with high level of restraints. And normally these are compulsory admission. And you have more severe, obviously, symptoms when you relapse. So after having done this analysis of data in London, we wanted to see if what we found there was actually generalizing to other parts of Europe, including Spain. And this is a multi-center study that, as you can see, covers 5 European countries and several sites. And what I had to do firstly was to calculate the potency of the type of cannabis that you expect people to use across these different sites. And I couldn't rely anymore just on names, but what I did do was rely on publication that had been fed into the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction report, where data had been published on the potency of the type of cannabis used in Spain, in the Netherlands, and in Italy, and in the other sites, part of the study. And I impose a cutoff of 10%, which comes from experimental design, and anything that we expected to be equal or greater than 10% was high potency, and anything less than 10% was considered low potency. And people were allowed to give the name of the cannabis they were using in their own language, and then we could match it with the available data from each country, part of this report. So this is in some way a similar graph to the one I presented to you earlier, except that it does have the potency variable expressed, as I explained, as equal or greater than 10% of THC or less than 10% of THC, and then he has the frequency. And here we had the data on the overall sample, but here I was very keen for you to look at how the 3 main cities of the sample compared. So for all of them, you can see that when you look at this green bar, which is the one of daily users of high potency cannabis, they all had a striking increase in the odds ratio for psychotic disorder, which in Amsterdam went up to over 9. And this is because in Amsterdam, when you look at a group with equal or greater than 10% of THC, you're actually capturing people who are using a very potent and highly concentrated cannabis with THC that is far above 30%. And I know that you have heard also Professor Murray presenting this data on the study and on the incident, and how the high potency variation across Europe were correlated heavily with the variation in the incidence rate of psychosis across Europe. So I will not present this data. But why should potency matter? Well, in UK, we tend to joke, thanks to this vignette from the Sunday Times, that it is the high potency cannabis that got our politician to think that we could do Brexit in the first place, and a Brexit with no deal as well. But apart from the effect on the brain of politician, what we do know is that, first of all, the plant, the cannabis sativa, has a genetic composition by which, if we select a type of plant that is driving lots of THC production, we can't expect it to produce CBD as well, which is what we get in the plant for skunk, and also the one where that is used to produce the resin or the hashish that is coming from Morocco right now. And this is because THC and CBD within the plant come from the same precursor, so from the same molecule that is either shunted to produce THC or CBD. And we know that these two compounds have very different effects. So while THC is known to have an impairment on attention, memory, and learning, and can also induce, although very frequently, hallucination, but very frequently paranoid ideas. On the contrary, CBD has got no effect in terms of psychotic symptoms, tends to be associated with relief of anxiety, although this is still not entirely clear, but certainly has no adverse effect on cognition, which is why if you do have perhaps both THC and CBD in a type of cannabis, this will make a difference in terms of the effect that you expect to experience. And this has been very elegantly explained in an experiment by Dr. Morrison that you see up there in the picture, who was so clever to have two brains, one of his own, an extra one. And in his experimental design, he offered to healthy volunteers with no previous history of psychosis intravenous THC. That was a very popular study where lots of volunteers queuing to be included. And this is an experiment where the same people were invited in two different occasions. They were blind to what they were getting. And in one occasion, they received placebo followed by intravenous THC. And as you can see, they were rated on the y-axis for positive psychotic symptoms, so the sort of paranoia and also for hallucination that we have mentioned before. And as you can see, those who receive placebo and THC within half an hour develop psychotic symptoms, which have clinical relevance, so they're quite disturbing. Luckily, then they disappear within 90 minutes. The one who were pre-treated with CBD rather than placebo and then get THC, on the contrary, they have a little increase in some suspiciousness, but no clinical relevance. And of course, anything disappears in 90 minutes, which suggests that CBD is able to actually ameliorate, counteract, reduce, if you like, the ability of THC to induce psychotic symptoms, in this case, psychotic life experiences. But again, what about at a population level? If we think about the data that we have looked from the population, the UGI multi-center study. So you are familiar now with the concept of the population attributable fraction, because I presented this data in relation to London. And here you can see that, again, when we think about London, the population attributable fraction for use of high potency is 30%. And this reflects the fact that there's been much more use of high potency cannabis since the first study. And in Amsterdam, it's as high as 50% for two reasons. One, because it's frequently used, and two, because the potency is higher, for instance, than the one in London. When we look at other sites like Italy, it's much lower because there's no high potency cannabis. And you would like to know that Spain sits in between London and Italy, with a population attributable fraction around 12%, which actually reflects the overall effects in the rest of Europe. So when we published this data, some criticism included the reference to some study that had been published in the meantime that indicated that perhaps people who have lots of genes for schizophrenia are actually more likely to use cannabis in the first place. And so the reason why then develop psychotic disorder is because they have lots of schizophrenia genes, and they would have developed anyway, independently of cannabis use. Well, we tried to address this question with the data we had available. And what we actually found was that when we redid on the overall sample our analysis on frequency and potency, and we controlled for schizophrenia genes, which we could measure in a quite robust way that now is done in psychiatric genetics by summarizing all the schizophrenia genes that each participant of the study were carrying. We found that even when we controlled for schizophrenia genes, we still had a 5-fold in the overall sample increase of risk for psychotic disorder in the one that were using high potency cannabis daily. And this was significant as well for those who use daily low potency or can use weekly high potency. And also we looked if overall in our sample, having lots of genes for schizophrenia predicted the chances of being a cannabis user or a heavy cannabis user or a high potency cannabis user, and the answer was not, both when we looked only in the healthy volunteers and when we look at the cases. But then what we wanted to analyze is what happens if you have both, if you have lots of schizophrenia genes and you use cannabis heavily. Because we've seen from other conditions in medicine, like for instance, if you think about myocardial infarct, that if you have 2 risk factors, it's always worse than one. Why? So why should it be different for psychotic disorder? And in fact, it isn't. This graph looks complicated, but all it's telling you is that if you look at the x-axis, where you have an increased load for schizophrenia gene, and here you look at the probability of having a psychotic disorder, each line is telling you a combination of how frequently you have been using cannabis, and there is also the line that tells you how is the risk of people that never use cannabis at all. And you can see that for all of them, as you would expect, more schizophrenia gene, more likely you are to develop a psychotic disorder. But the group with the highest risk is the one that use high potency on daily basis. So when you combine the two, the news is a bad news, much worse than having one of the 2 risk factors. But all of this research would be meaningless if we wouldn't translate it into clinical practice. And as I said, I'm a clinician that looks after young people who develop psychosis in the context of cannabis use. So what we did, thanks to some charity funding, was to develop a unique service where we saw young people who had developed a psychotic disorder in the context of cannabis use, and they were continuing to use, but they wanted to make a change, either reduce or stop, to see if that was having an impact, a positive impact on their clinical condition, but overall in their quality of life, because they wanted to go, and this is a vignette they created, from this level of brain interference by cannabis to a brain free to embrace other activity dear to them. And so this is my wonderful team. As you can see, there are lots of young people. There is also Professor Mari, who is one of the experts, part of the steering committee, who informs the way and provides support for the work we do. Very happy to hear the data from the first 17 people who completed the work with our clinic. And so to give you an idea of the people we see in our clinic, these are young people in their early 20s. 80% of them are using, I'm sorry you can't see where it says value in the blue part of the pie chart, you say 80%, are using the famous skunk, so high potency cannabis. The little one is using hashish, and everybody else is using actually type of cannabis who are becoming available in London, who are very highly concentrated in THC. And they all mixing it with tobacco, and that's why we work in collaboration with our colleagues from the Tobacco Cessation program. So first of all, you can see in this graph how they all start. This is a measure of dependence on cannabis, highly dependent on cannabis. This is the threshold where you measure dependence. And this is what they are at the end of the intervention. And this is an average. So this includes the one who is 10 out of 17 who are completely stopped, with the one who have gone down to using only once per week. Here you have a measure of tobacco use, which is not really changed between baseline and follow-up, but is not a significant dependence. So these are mostly people who have a bit of tobacco in the joint. And here's a measure of alcohol. So you can see that these are people that predominantly are using cannabis. And this is a measure of how the level of functioning changes between baseline and follow-up. When you use the GAF to measure level of functioning, higher is the score, better is the level of functioning. So as you can see, for both the measure of symptoms that have an impact on functioning, and also when you look at actually functioning in practice in your daily activities, the score improves in both. So you go for the symptoms from moderate symptoms to absence, or only mild that come if there is a stressful event, and you have a significant improvement in your ability to look after yourself and to attend to your daily task. But what about symptoms? Because here we're talking about the link with psychosis. So as you can see, between baseline and hallucination, there's not much change in how many hallucination people experience, because there is not a huge impact of cannabis on hallucination. But when you look at delusions, so the thoughts that we discussed at the beginning, this idea held against the evidence of the contrary, usually of paranoid nature, you can see that they significantly dropped when people significantly reduce their cannabis use from daily to once a week or even stop. And this is very important, because not only they go from experiencing this delusion on a daily basis to much more rarely, but also the degree of conviction. So how really convinced they are, or how true these beliefs are, goes from 50–60% to only 10%, with severe distress to only slight distress. So this has a huge impact on quality of life of these young people and their ability to engage in other activities. And this is a nice article that came out on the London Sunday Times, which brings together the experience of the people who have received the intervention and successfully stopped using cannabis. And I'd just like to read you one that is here at the bottom that says, now with the clinic, I'm looking at life in a whole different way. My brain is starting to work again. I'm doing an apprenticeship and it has changed my life. So the bottom line, to go back to the title, if you develop psychosis in the context of cannabis use, the answer is that if you do stop it or reduce it, you can change the course of your illness. And even more importantly, if you make changes earlier on in your use, you might even prevent its onset. Thank you very much. And of course, I would like to thank the team that has allowed both my research and allows my clinical work to carry on. And more importantly, I'd like to thank all the young people with psychosis and cannabis use who have inspired my work, and they continue to work by my side. Thank you very much for your attention.